Welcome to another deep dive into one of America's darkest minds. You're listening to Serial Killer Files, brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we head into the cold heart of rural America to uncover a story that blurs the line between madness, murder, and myth. Plainfield, Wisconsin. Population, not many. In the 1950s, it was the kind of place where everybody knew your name and your secrets. But no one, not the neighbors, not the sheriff, not even the kids who grew up around him, could have imagined what was really going on behind the peeling walls of that rundown farmhouse at the edge of town. The man who lived there, Ed Gein, quiet, withdrawn, seemed more odd than dangerous. Folks around called him eccentric, maybe a little slow, maybe just lonely. But after November 16th, 1957, nobody would call him harmless ever again. That's the day police walked into his home, and straight into a nightmare. What they found inside wasn't just shocking, it was the stuff of horror movies. Human remains turned into furniture, skulls used as bowls, skin stretched into lampshades, a belt made from nipples, and worst of all, a mask made from a woman's face. You've heard of Norman Bates. You've heard of Buffalo Bill. You've seen Leatherface tear through victims with a chainsaw. All of them, every one, draws a line back to Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, the original American Boogeyman. But here's the thing. Ed Gein was only convicted of murdering 2 women. That's it. Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. So why does his name live on in infamy? Why does his face still haunt our nightmares? Because it wasn't just the murders, it was what he did after. Today, we're peeling back the rotting layers of Gein's life. His childhood under the iron grip of a fanatically religious mother, the isolation that warped his view of the world, and the grave robbing that started long before the killing ever did. We'll examine how mental illness, religious obsession, and unchecked trauma turned a shy farm boy into something monstrous. And we'll explore how the crimes he committed not only horrified a nation, but rewired our pop culture's image of evil forever. We'll go through the court records, the forensic reports, and the infamous inventory list of what was found in that house. We'll hear how the town of Plainfield tried to move on, how they burned the Gein house to the ground, hoping to erase the memory of what happened there. But memories like that, they don't burn so easy. So lock the doors, dim the lights, and whatever you do, don't look in the barn. This is the Butcher of Plainfield, and you're listening to Serial Killer Files with Arthur Morgan. To understand Ed Gein, we must first understand Augusta Gein, a woman whose twisted worldview would shape one of America's most notorious killers. Ed was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His elder brother Henry was his only sibling, and together they grew up under the iron fist of their deeply disturbed mother. Their father George was an alcoholic who struggled to hold down any job, bouncing between insurance sales, carpentry, and tanning. The family even owned a grocery store briefly, but Augusta had bigger plans. She wanted isolation, complete and total isolation from what she saw as a morally corrupt world. In 1914, the Geins made their final move to a 195-acre farm in Plainfield. And here's something fascinating. It was Augusta, not her husband, who was the official purchaser and deed holder. This was highly unusual for a woman in 1914, but Augusta Gein was no ordinary woman. The property was impressive, a 2-story L-shaped white farmhouse with a parlor, kitchen, bedrooms, and 5 additional upstairs rooms. There was a barn, chicken coop, equipment shack, and summer kitchen. Augusta furnished it meticulously with cherry bureaus, wooden rocking chairs, oriental carpets, and leather-bound books. She took immense pride in keeping an impeccably clean and organized home. But what Augusta loved most about this place was its seclusion. The farm sat 6 miles west of Plainfield Village, a considerable distance in an era of dirt roads and horse-drawn wagons. Their closest neighbors, the Johnsons, lived a quarter-mile away. Otherwise, the GEIN'S were surrounded by meadows, marshland, and endless acres of pale, sandy soil. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was Augusta's design. She quickly decided that Plainfield's moral and religious standards were disgracefully low. In her twisted perception, the hard-working, devout townsfolk were dishonorable and unreliable. She considered herself superior and preferred to limit all interactions with them. As a Lutheran in a town of Catholics, Methodists, and Baptists, she took it upon herself to provide her sons with what she called proper religious and moral guidance. But Augusta's version of guidance was psychological torture. Picture this. Every single afternoon, without fail, Augusta would gather her sons Ed and Henry to recite Bible verses. But these weren't your typical Sunday school lessons. Augusta had a particular fascination with passages dealing with murder, divine retribution, and death. She would lecture the boys relentlessly about the world's immorality and the evils of alcohol, ironic considering her husband's alcoholism. But her most venomous hatred was reserved for women. Augusta believed that all women, except herself, were the devil's tools. She had a special contempt for prostitutes and would fill her sons' heads with the idea that female sexuality was inherently evil. The boys were only permitted to leave the property for school. Whenever strangers approached the Gein farm, Augusta would drive them away. She was creating a bubble of isolation and twisted ideology with herself as the sole moral authority. As the boys grew older, the cracks in this system began to show. In 1940, their father George died of heart failure, likely a consequence of his years of alcoholism. This left Augusta even more dependent on her sons and them on her. Ed and Henry began taking odd jobs around town to contribute to the family income. But Henry was starting to see through their mother's manipulation. As an adult, he became increasingly concerned about Ed's unnaturally close relationship with Augusta. Any negative comments about their mother would elicit strong, emotional reactions from Ed, and this worried Henry deeply. Then came May 1944, and a tragedy that many believe was actually the first murder Ed Gein ever committed. On that fateful day in May 1944, a marsh fire on the Gein property got out of control. The local fire department was called to help extinguish the blaze, and afterward, Ed reported his brother Henry missing. A search party was quickly organized. They found Henry's body lying face down in the marshland. He appeared to have been dead for some time, and the official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from the smoke. But there was something that didn't add up. Later reports suggested there were bruises on Henry's head, injuries that seemed inconsistent with death by smoke inhalation. This sparked suspicions of possible murder, with Ed as the prime suspect. Many investigators who interrogated Gein later in his life came to believe he was responsible for his brother's death. Think about it from Ed's perspective. Henry had been increasingly critical of their mother, questioning the unhealthy dynamic that Ed cherished. With Henry gone, Ed would have Augusta's complete, undivided attention. For someone with Ed's disturbed psychology, this would have been the perfect motive. Following Henry's death, Augusta suffered a severe stroke. Ed became her primary caregiver, a role that he seemed to relish. He was finally the sole focus of his mother's world, just as she was the center of his. But this twisted paradise couldn't last forever. After a second stroke, Augusta passed away in December 1945, leaving Ed absolutely devastated. At the age of 39, he was suddenly alone for the first time in his life. Ed managed to keep the farm and earned a living through odd jobs. As a handyman, he even qualified for a government farm subsidy, which he began receiving in 1951. To the outside world, he seemed to be managing reasonably well as a bachelor farmer. But inside the farmhouse, something deeply disturbing was happening. Ed preserved the rooms his mother had used, her parlor, her bedroom, leaving them completely untouched and pristine, like shrines to her memory. He kept Augusta's cherry bureau, her rocking chair, her oriental carpet, exactly as she had left them. These rooms became sacred spaces that he would clean and maintain, but never truly inhabit. Meanwhile, the sections of the house where Ed actually lived became extremely unkempt. The contrast was stark. Augusta's spaces remained perfect, while Ed's areas descended into chaos and filth. Living in complete solitude, Ed developed new interests. He became fascinated with magazines, particularly those covering death and cannibalism. He would pore over these publications, feeding a growing obsession with mortality and the human body. But reading wasn't enough. Ed needed something more tangible, more real. And that's when he began his nocturnal visits to the Plainfield Cemetery. Between 1947 and 1954, Ed Gein embarked on a systematic campaign of grave robbing that would eventually encompass around 40 graves. He had a specific method and particular preferences that reveal the disturbing psychology behind his actions. Gein would study the local obituaries, paying special attention to middle-aged women who had recently died. He had a particular interest in women who reminded him of his mother, not necessarily in appearance, but in age and demeanor. Once he identified a target, he would wait for the funeral to pass, then strike while the grave was still fresh. The sandy soil of Plainfield Cemetery worked in his favor. The coffins were buried in wooden boxes with boards laid crosswise, only about 2 feet below the surface. This made Gein's ghoulish work much easier than it would have been in other locations. He would work under cover of darkness, carefully digging up his targets. Sometimes he would take entire bodies. Other times, he would remove specific parts that caught his interest. Strangely, he would occasionally return items, rings, jewelry, even body parts, though his reasoning for this selective generosity remains unclear. When authorities later investigated, they weren't sure if someone as physically small as Gein could dig up an entire grave alone in one night. To verify his confessions, they reopened 3 of the graves he claimed to have violated. The findings were chilling. One was completely empty, another contained a few bones and Gein's crowbar, and the third was missing most of the body, with only some returned items and jewelry left behind. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Gein claimed he would often be in a daze during these grave-robbing sprees. He said when he felt one of these spells coming on, he would pray, and sometimes the prayers would snap him out of it before he acted. He insisted he hadn't robbed a grave since 1954, suggesting his prayers had become more effective. Of course, there was a much simpler explanation for why Gein stopped robbing graves in 1954. That's when he discovered a more reliable source for fresh bodies. Here's the key to understanding Ed Gein's transformation from grave robber to killer. He didn't have a specific urge to murder. What he needed was corpses, and he had grown dependent on a steady supply. The Wisconsin winters posed a serious problem for Gein's nocturnal activities. When the ground froze solid, grave robbing became nearly impossible. The sandy soil that made his work so easy in warmer months turned into an impenetrable barrier when winter set in. But Gein's needs hadn't changed. If anything, his dependence on human remains had grown stronger over the years. He had been crafting what he called a woman suit, an actual garment made from human skin that would allow him to literally become his mother. To maintain and expand this grotesque project, he needed fresh materials. So when grave robbing became impossible, Gein adapted. He began killing to maintain his supply. The first victim was Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner who vanished on December 8, 1954. At the crime scene, authorities found a pool of blood, a knocked-over chair, and a spent cartridge from a .32 caliber pistol. Gein was a suspect, but no charges were filed at the time. During later interrogations, Gein admitted to shooting Mary Hogan, though he claimed he couldn't recall much about how she died. Her head was eventually found among the horrific collection in his farmhouse. But it was his second known murder that would finally expose Ed Gein's house of horrors to the world. November 16, 1957, started as an ordinary day in Plainfield. Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old woman, opened her hardware store as she had countless times before. She had no way of knowing she was about to become the key that would unlock one of America's most shocking criminal cases. Ed Gein had been a customer at WORDEN'S store before. He had even asked her out, which she had politely declined. The day before her disappearance, he had mentioned needing antifreeze, a detail that would prove crucial to the investigation. When Bernice failed to return home that evening, her son became worried. A check of the store revealed a chilling scene, traces of blood leading from the interior to the spot where her truck had been parked. The vehicle was gone, and so was Bernice. A sales receipt for antifreeze was found in the store, and Bernice's son remembered Gein's request from the previous day. Deputies decided to pay a visit to the isolated Gein farm. What they discovered there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When deputies arrived at the Gein farm, they first searched a shed behind the house. What they found there defied belief: the decapitated body of Bernice Worden, gutted and hanging from the rafters like a freshly killed deer. But this was only the beginning of the horror. Inside the farmhouse, the deputies discovered a collection of human remains and artifacts that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. In the kitchen, they found Bernice's heart sitting in a saucepan on the stove, as if Gein had been preparing it for a meal. The inventory of horrors seemed endless. Entrails in the refrigerator, vulvas and noses stored in shoeboxes, stockings made from human leg skin, a soup bowl crafted from a skull top, a vest made from a female torso complete with breasts, skulls mounted on Gein's bedposts like grotesque decorations. There were masks made from women's faces, adorned with lipstick to give them a lifelike appearance. A scalp was found in a cereal box. Investigators discovered chairs upholstered with human skin, a drum with a skin membrane, and jewelry crafted from body parts. 10 female heads were found in various states of preservation. Many of these artifacts had been carefully oiled to maintain their appearance and flexibility. One vulva had a red ribbon threaded through it, like some twisted holiday ornament. The attention to detail was meticulous and deeply disturbing. But perhaps most chilling of all was the woman suit itself, a complete outfit made from human skin that Gein could wear to transform himself into his idealized version of a woman, specifically his mother. When confronted with the evidence, Ed Gein confessed readily to his crimes, but his explanations revealed a mind that operated on a completely different moral plane from the rest of humanity. Gein provided authorities with comprehensive details about his grave robbing activities, a complete list of his victims, exact dates of his nocturnal excavations, and elaborate descriptions of his methods. He showed no shame or remorse about these activities. However, he was adamant about certain aspects of his behavior. When investigators suggested he might have engaged in sexual activities with the corpses, Gein became genuinely outraged. But his indignation wasn't due to the moral reprehensibility of necrophilia. It was because he found the bodies too unpleasant smelling for sexual contact. Gein also vehemently denied ever eating human flesh, despite the evidence of body parts being prepared as food. He maintained that his interest in the bodies was purely scientific, claiming that as a child he had wanted to become a doctor, and grave robbing was his way of exploring human anatomy firsthand. The woman's suit, he explained as his attempt to literally become his mother, to wear her skin and in some psychological sense, become her. This wasn't sexual in his mind, but transformational. Despite his denials about sexual activity and cannibalism, experts who studied the case believed Gein was likely lying or repressing these aspects of his behavior. His actions aligned perfectly with necrophilia, and the evidence suggested he had indeed consumed human flesh. The Ed Gein case attracted attention from psychiatrists and psychologists across the country, each eager to understand what had created such a monster. The diagnosis varied, but certain themes emerged consistently. Dr. Edward J. Kelleher, head of the Chicago Municipal Court's Psychiatric Institute, was firm in his assessment. Gein was definitively schizophrenic, a condition directly caused by his mother's influence. Dr. Kelleher explained that Gein's behavior demonstrated extreme ambivalence, the ability to feel both love and hatred toward the same person simultaneously. This was most evident in his relationship with women, particularly those who reminded him of his mother. The psychiatrist traced this back to Augusta's twisted teachings. She had convinced Ed that all women except herself were evil, creating a fundamental split in his psyche. He simultaneously revered his mother while absorbing her hatred of femininity, leading to violent, conflicted feelings toward all women. According to Dr. Kelleher, this abnormal attitude produced severe symptoms including transvestism, fetishism, and necrophilia. Even Charles Wilson, director of the crime lab, agreed that an Oedipus complex likely played a central role in Gein's pathology. The case became a topic of amateur psychoanalysis throughout Wisconsin. Subjects rarely discussed in 1950s America, sexual deviance, transvestism, necrophilia, suddenly became dinner table conversation as people tried to understand how such evil could exist in their midst. While Ed Gein confessed to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, investigators suspected his victim count was higher. The search of his home uncovered organs from 2 young women that couldn't be matched to any known cemetery records, suggesting additional victims. Beyond his brother Henry's suspicious death, there were other disappearances that pointed to Gein. A man named Travis and his unnamed companion were last seen when they hired Gein as their hunting guide. They were never seen again, and their case was never fully investigated. For years before his arrest, local children who visited Gein's farmhouse reported seeing shrunken heads and strange masks on the walls. Their parents dismissed these accounts as childhood imagination, never realizing their children were witnesses to evidence of multiple murders. What's particularly chilling is that none of these children ever reported feeling threatened by Gein. He seemed genuinely fond of them, and they of him. His neighbor's comment after Gein's death captured this disturbing contradiction. Good old Ed, kind of a loner and maybe a little odd, but just the guy to call in to sit with the kiddies when me and the old lady want to go to the show. This dual nature, the harmless handyman and the grave-robbing killer, made Gein particularly terrifying. To his community, if someone so seemingly benign could harbor such darkness, who could be trusted? That's our deep dive into the disturbing legacy of Ed Gein, a case that reminds us evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind soft-spoken manners, behind a neighbor's smile, behind the door of a farmhouse on the edge of town. Gein spent the rest of his life behind locked doors, declared insane, never facing a traditional trial. He died in 1984, not in a prison cell, but in a hospital bed. His victims and the pain he caused never got that kind of peace. But this story isn't just about Gein himself. It's about what he revealed, about how trauma can twist the human mind, about how easily cruelty can wear the face of normalcy, and about the chilling truth that the most terrifying monsters are sometimes the ones who seem the most harmless. If you want to dig deeper into the psychological profile of Ed Gein, explore the full crime scene inventory, and examine how his story shaped modern horror cinema, from Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, head over to the Skoob app now. You'll also find extended expert interviews, archived reports, and never-before-seen crime scene photographs that paint an even darker picture of the man behind the mask. Because this isn't just a horror story. It's a case study in how darkness grows, in silence, in isolation, and in homes that look just like yours. Download Skoob on the App Store or Google Play to unlock the full investigation. I'm Arthur Morgan, and this has been Serial Killer Files. Until next time, trust your instincts, question what you think you know, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.